welcome to another cross-border talk, which stays true to looking for progressive ways to look at events in Europe and the world. And today, our interlocutor is one of the important persons of the British left-wing circles. James Schneider was the campaign director of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign for the parliament, and he's also the PR of the Progressive International and founder of the Momentum grassroots movement, which supported Jeremy Corbyn. A number of issues are to be discussed with him. Labour just won the elections, and the government in Britain is now formed by Keir Starmer. And immediately after Labour took the power, riots erupted, anti-immigrant riots in the UK. Well, my first question towards James Schneider would be, in fact, what he makes of this. What is the reason for these riots, given that for a long time the UK was somehow considered a model for integration and of people from migrant communities, and oddly, just in the moment when the Labour, the left wing, let's say, won the elections, these riots started. So does this mean that beside a rise of or certain change of power with left wing coming in front, there is also extreme right, which is on the rise?
So I think we should start with saying what happened over the last month or so, because they've been mischaracterized as a set of protests. Sometimes they're reported as being anti-migrant protests, and that's not what we saw. What we saw was racist violence in small pockets that was engaging in racially motivated and often anti-Muslim targeted violent attacks against, for example, mosques were attacked. Hotels housing people claiming asylum who are seeking refugee status were attacked and set on fire. People were pulled out of their cars because of the color of their skin. An informal checkpoint was set up in one town to prevent anyone who wasn't white driving down a road. So these were not protests that had fringe elements that engaged in this type of racist violence. The racist violence was at the core of them. They started after an horrific stabbing of which killed 3 young girls at a dance class in Southport, a town in northwest England. And after this attack, it was wrongly stated that the attacker had been Muslim, or had been. Another rumor was that the attacker had come over as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, or was a foreign criminal. None of this was true. The attacker was a 17-year-old boy from Wales, whose parents were from Rwanda, but he was from Wales, which are part of the United Kingdom, and was Christian. So the far-right racist organisers came from outside Southport, mobilised some people within the town of Southport, and attacked the mosque there. This set off copycat and some of it organised racist attacks on people and mobilisations in other towns and cities across the UK, and that's the nature of them.
Okay, but given that now there is also a conflict going on in the Middle East, could we read these anti-migrant and anti-Muslim riots as some kind of echo and interconnected with the contestation which goes on now in the Middle East and especially in Gaza?
Certainly, yes, because what we have had in Britain now for 10 plus months is very large mobilizations in opposition to Israeli crimes against the Palestinians and in opposition to our government's complicity in those crimes through arms sales to Israel and diplomatic cover provided to Israel. We have had a media and political class driven moral panic for 10 months about these protests, which where we have been told that they are anti-Semitic, that they are hate marches, that our former foreign secretary, the former interior minister who called these hate marches, said that London was in control of Islamists and anti-Semites. And we had this type of ludicrous, completely removed from reality messages pumped out by predominantly the right of politics, but also from parts of the Labour Party as well, and much of the media. So that, I'm sure, is connected. You can also see that it is connected, this idea, because one of the motivating ideas, again, completely not based in fact, the opposite is true, in fact, the idea of two-tier policing. So the far right, which like the street far right, like Tommy Robinson, the pundit intellectual far right, like Matthew Goodwin, and the political far right, like Nigel Farage and Suella Braverman and so forth, have all been speaking about two-tier policing, by which they mean that pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which have been overwhelmingly peaceful, are huge. There are fewer arrests at them than there are at your average Premier League football match. Very low levels of disturbance at all, actually very well organised and very disciplined, were not shut down. That's what they wanted them to see happen to them, to have them shut down. And because when the far right and these racist violence went to attack, for example, migrant hotels, eventually the police showed up and did arrest some people. So they say this is evidence of two-tier policing. The usual reactionary idea that really the powerful forces in society are somehow being victimized. So there are, of course, connections between these two things. And it's no surprise that when the far right riots ran out of steam was when the ordinary people of the country mobilized against them. So they announced through Telegram and other channels a series of sites which were primarily law centers that support refugees and migrants, but also some accommodation housing refugee claimants. And that these were going to all happen simultaneously, I think in 30 locations. And in a great number of them, across London, in Bristol, in Brighton, and so on, there were huge counter-mobilizations of ordinary people who showed very clearly that the organized violence of the far right is a minority pursuit in Britain. And one of the flags that was waved at those big counter mobilizations, which sent the racist packing, was the Palestinian flag as a symbol for justice. Now, that doesn't mean that racism, particularly anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, is restricted to the racist violence of this small minority, because it is entirely mainstreamed across much of our politics and our media, as it has been for now well over 2 decades.
Okay, you mentioned accusations of anti-Semitism which appear here and there all the time. And I remember that such accusations were directed towards Jeremy Corbyn during his tenure as leader of the Labour Party. And you also mentioned that huge crowds supported roughly, let's say, the progressive or Palestinian cause. So I also remember that Labour Party had better results in terms of votes during Corbyn era. But in spite of that, I need to say that it was Keir Starmer who brought Labour to power. And I wonder what are your lessons, if you wish, from the fact that it was not Jeremy Corbyn who won the elections and became the Prime Minister of UK, but it was Keir Starmer, and perhaps that means maybe Starmer did something better in some way. I don't know.
So what happened in the election we just had was a profound rejection of the political class in Britain. Just they haven't realised it yet. The Conservative Party lost over half or around half of its votes in comparison to the 2019 general election. But also the Labour Party lost over 500,000 votes as well. What happened, because we have a first past the post system, the dissolution of the right-wing bloc that had cohered under Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, in effect split in two between the Conservative Party and Reform. So despite Labour getting fewer votes in 2024 than in 2019, only just under 34% of those who cast their votes on a hugely reduced turnout, only 52% of adults in British adults voted in the general election. Labour won this tremendous landslide because of the complete collapse of the Conservative Party, and in a predominantly two-party first-past-the-post system, what matters is the gap between those two parties. So Labour won what has been commonly referred to as a loveless landslide. It is a tremendous landslide. It's a huge number of seats, well over 400 seats in a 650-seat parliament, but on a reduced number of votes from an election in 2019, which was supposedly, according to the political media class, a historic defeat for the Labour Party. Not to mention the 2017 election, where Labour got more than 3 million votes, more than Labour just won this huge landslide.
Okay, I still want to challenge you to comment on the program or the promises or the style of Keir Starmer, because he had some really motivational Obama-styled or Mazzucato-styled rhetorics on a number of issues. You remember maybe the book Mission Economy by Mariana Mazzucato, who seems to have some influence on him. So what are your expectations regarding his both internal social and economic program and his international ambitions?
So Keir Starmer's strategy has been consistent all the way through, which is to not challenge the powerful, not frighten the ruling orders in Britain, so that if and when the Conservative Party collapses under the weight of 14 years of rule, where most people in Britain are worse off than they were at the beginning of it, that there would be a seamless handing of the baton over to him and he would be in office. And that is indeed what has happened. The Labour Party campaign, I'm not sure which one you were watching, if you thought there was anything inspirational or Obama-ish about it. Keir Starmer is probably by his own estimation, a very dry and boring public speaker, not like Barack Obama at all. And the Labour manifesto was the smallest in terms of changes to tax and spend of any of the parties and of any manifesto there had been for many, many years. It was extremely thin in terms of a program with very small policies. In effect, the strategy was to say very little and stand next to the Conservative Party, which was a bin on fire, and say, do you want to vote for the bin on fire or me? And in the end, most people chose to not vote for either of them, but more voted for Labour than for the bin fire, and so Keir Starmer is Prime Minister. On the point about Mariana Mazzucato, her mission-led idea has not really made it into Labour's programme or agenda other than the word mission. Labour has 5 so-called missions, but they don't really conform other than one of them, which is the clean energy by 2030. 4 of the 5 missions don't conform to the Mazzucato model of a mission. One of them does. On its domestic agenda, the domestic agenda, in its true meaning, is an attempt to restore respect for and consent in the ruling order of things. They will struggle to do this because they don't have any policies really to improve the basic living standards of most people. Since they have come in on the economic front, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, the Finance Secretary, and in effect Finance Minister, has been extremely orthodox and announced a number of spending cuts in order to so-called balance the books. There's been no policies brought forward, and nor will there be brought forward in the immediate term to boost the living standards of the majority. Their programme rested on the idea of growth. And by idea, I do mean idea, i.e. not based in any material policies or changes. Their wager is twofold. First, that Labour will be more stable in some regards than the Conservatives, and therefore this stability will attract additional investment, which is a pretty tenuous argument. The second is that some mild changes to planning regulation will stimulate perhaps 100,000 more homes built over the course of a parliament, or maybe 200,000 more homes built over the course of the parliament above what the Conservative Party were offering. And somehow this will act as an enormous multiplier, which will unlock other growth areas in the economy, which will lead to higher tax returns and then more money to spend on public services. This seems wishful thinking. In effect, their economic policy boils down to saying we will simply hit the button that says growth. On the international sphere, Labour will engage in the traditional foreign policy of Labour. Of course, there have been some areas where they've been at odds with this traditional Labour foreign policy, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, or partially under Harold Wilson when he refused to take Britain into Vietnam alongside the US. Our role is to tuck in behind the US and to follow their lead. Britain does not really have an independent foreign policy. And Keir Starmer's aim is to continue that, is to not have an independent foreign policy and to, in effect, tuck in behind the US position. And that's what we're already seeing so far.
You mentioned that Keir Starmer sticks to close ties with the US, but he also seems to be trying some improvement of the relations with the EU. To what extent his government or the UK has common interests with the EU?
Yes, certainly there are, and they are improving ties with Europe, which is in no way means a break with US foreign policy imperatives either. I mean, it's not like Germany and the US, for example, have particularly different foreign policies. This is in the aftermath of Britain leaving the EU, which was done in such a way as to sever or greatly reduce and restrict relations between, especially on security and foreign policy matters, between Europe and Britain. Now, the security and defence establishments of Europe, of Britain, and of the US are not in favour of a severing of those relations, but of a strengthening of those relations, and that is what we are seeing. We are seeing some of that in some other areas, and there are movements towards some sensible re-establishing of collaboration on some other social and scientific areas. which of course is welcome, but doesn't change the fundamental posture of the government.
Another issue which Keir Starmer should probably relate to and respond somehow is the war in the Middle East and the tensions, even war in Gaza and tensions between Israel and Iran. It is a very interesting situation for, I think, from a progressive point of view, which is the progressive political force now in the Middle East. At first sight, it looks like there are a bunch of fundamentalisms, often religious based gangs, if I may say. So, given that you are also a progressive person, what is the progressive vision for change now in the Middle East, and who is the avant-garde, if there is such a force?
So first to Britain and its role, which is to fundamentally support the US and Britain and the US's ally Israel, but to do so slightly more under the veneer of the rule of law, which of course the US throws entirely out the window, and as has Israel. So the objections that the previous British government had placed to the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor's request for arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Palestinians in Gaza was withdrawn by the new government. And it has initiated a new legal process, and totally unnecessary, but nevertheless, a new legal process to establish whether British arms sales are legal because of the clear and indisputable breaches of international law that are being undertaken with the weaponry provided by Britain or by the weaponry that British parts contribute to, such as the F-16 and the F-35 fighter jets. As to the region itself, the primary focus must be on ending what is a plausible genocide where tens of thousands, if not more, people have been killed by an occupying power in an area that is yet to be decolonized. We have clearly established principles under international law to know how to view and to respond to such a situation. So I think the primary objective has to be to break the capacity for Israel's war machine to continue to displace, deny, and destroy the Palestinians wherever they are. And currently that isn't happening. There are not a huge range of powerful progressive actors, as you note, in the region. A number of the regional countries have not played particularly powerfully strong roles in trying to support the Palestinians in facing the destruction that they are facing at the hands of the Israeli war machine and its funders and armors, primarily in the US, but also in Europe as well. In Israel itself, of course, there is a small, but very small, set of progressive forces that are opposed to Israel's long-standing state policy of annexation using the method of ethnic cleansing under the guise of self-defense. But of course, the so-called left in Israeli politics, or sometimes referred to as the center, wishes to pursue very similar policies to the current government, but without saying the quiet part out loud. The problem for the so-called center in Israeli politics and some of the more squeamish parts of the US, UK, and European establishments that support Israel is the fact that it has members of its government that clearly say and clearly articulate the genocidal ambitions and annexationist and supremacist ambitions that they have for the entire area from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. Within Palestine itself, of course, the Palestinian factions have been divided for a very long time, and that disunity has set back the Palestinian cause. I note that recently there were negotiations in China which helped bring together the 14 factions, at least around a common statement that they wish to form a unified transitional government across both Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem ahead of elections, and to have a body that manages the reconstruction of Gaza, which has been pretty much entirely flattened and destroyed. But under the current circumstances of this ongoing destruction, the dynamics are likely towards more desperate violence. I noticed that Hamas seemed to have returned to suicide bombing for the first time since I think it was 2004, put that away for entering the political space in 2005, where they won elections which were then not accepted because in effect the wrong people had won. That of course is worrying. Suicide bombs by definition pretty much are indiscriminate and target civilians, and that is wrong. That is a breach. But you can see that as this continues, that as this destruction of Gaza continues, it makes those types of reactions, those types of wrong and illegal reactions more likely. So going back to your question, what's the outlook? What's the most important thing? The most important thing for the dynamics is to reduce Israel's capacity to destroy and control the Palestinians, because the only way to get to a negotiated solution, whatever that negotiated solution will be, requires a change in the balance of power between Israel's ability to continually destroy the Palestinians. Now, part of that comes from the attempts to undermine the Israeli war machine through its international supply chain. Part of that comes from international action. For example, Colombia, which has banned coal exports to Israel, and other elements that isolate Israel's capacity to wreak its disastrous, destructive campaign on the Palestinians.
At the end of this cross-border talk, I would like to ask you something about Jeremy Corbyn. He had really inspirational moment in Labour's history, given that he brought hundreds of thousands new members to the party. But he's now an independent. And I was wondering, what is the political future or political ambitions of Jeremy Corbyn in this current situation, in which he's a member of the parliament but an independent one?
I think the moment is now very open. As I was saying before, Labour have won a loveless landslide. Only 52% of British adults voted. Only 37% of tenants, those who rent their homes either socially or through the private sector, voted. There are wide levels of dissatisfaction with our political media class, and the economic situation seems to not be getting better. We've had an enormous squeeze on living standards. So what we're seeing from Jeremy and from others is to build power at the base first by what we saw in the general election was 5 independents winning to the left of Labour, which had previously happened, I think, 3 or 4 times since World War II. So it's a real surprise set of results. And there were a number of other seats where independents were closely behind Labour. And this was mainly based in community power, the ability for communities to be organised to then take political power. So I think what we will see over the coming months is the coalescing of those forms of community organization in the areas where there is already political strength into some kind of entity which can put the left and progressive forces in a far stronger position to both speak to the country now and intervene in debates as they are taking place, to organize with people to improve their power, to put money back in their pockets and to resist the rise of the far right, and to be in a bit stronger position come the next election to have a larger electoral impact, potentially in partnership or alliance with the Green Party. So this is the current outlook. We're only a few weeks out from the general election, but there's a lot of organising going on in progressive spaces and places to bring together all of these different elements so that we can have a powerful and coordinated and united set of progressive forces that can make themselves felt in national discourse, socially to improve people's lives, and ultimately electorally to have wins in the political sphere.
Thank you for this talk. During the last half an hour, we passed through a number of current affairs issues in the UK and international relations, and thanks to our interlocutor James Schneider, we offered a progressive view on them. We invite everyone to follow Cross Border Talks on its social media channel like Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, Substack, etc. Thank you for joining us this time, and we see you again soon.